Hi, well, I'm gonna make a video and I'm gonna talk about my little planet here that I made. I took a globe and I just redrew on it, the what ifs and how I believe the world used to be before the poles changed place. Now, on the globe, we have right here, this is the way it would be, right? You have under here, if you could see this right here, this is Antarctica. And this is where the South Pole would be, right? And then up here, we have the North Pole, right there, see? Right there, like this. But I believe that the poles aren't in their right position. That before, the poles were directly in the ocean. And basically aligning some of the biggest mountains in the world. So, also the other thing is that the world is upside down right now. So basically, the South Pole is actually, where is actually the upper on the upper part, not on the lower part. I think our ancestors actually even knew this. This is the way they used to travel in the world. This used to be the South Pole up here, and it wasn't the South Pole down here. It was the South Pole up here. And that the North Pole was at the bottom, actually. But when it flipped upside down, I mean, they couldn't really make the difference of which one was the North and which one was the South now. Because, I mean, basically, I mean, lots of the things didn't change, so they still kind of have the same idea. And I think that this is actually because when you say South, it's actually closer to the word sun. And icho godogamatsuki akuchetsu davaide. It's actually in a lot of languages, it even sounds almost exactly the same. So basically, that's the way it used to be. The South Pole used to be on top, and it used to be the smaller of the two poles. So instead of having the North up here, the North is down here. And the North also, it's for darkness, nosa, So I think that that's the way it used to be before the poles became displaced. And you would ask, well, why would the poles become displaced? Well, because our ancestors poisoned the earth. Because our ancestors were not God-fearing, God-loving people. Well, at least some of them weren't. And I truly do believe that the earth was created by God, because if you have the right ingredients, evolution is very quick. It's like, what's been happening is that basically the world is very sick, and so are the animals, and so are the people. Our genes are sick, and when our genes heal, evolution is faster than light. It's quick. It's at the speed of light. And, well, this is a theory, but it's a plausible one. So what happened is we poisoned the earth, and things started to die, and things started to change. And God was going to just let it all be wiped out because he was discouraged by the behavior of his children, right? So basically what happened is that the poles were huge, giant ice continents. And see, I drew them in like in purple right there. See, there you go. And this is the South Pole, and it's coming off the mountains in Antarctica. See, right there. See, right there, like so. See, this is the pole right there, and it's coming off the mountains right there. And these huge ice continents are so enormous. Their sheer size is bigger, actually, than the poles. And this is because the ice, when it forms, it gets heavier, it pushes down, it gets heavier, it pushes down, and it builds, and it builds, and it builds, and when it touches the bottom, it also builds upward. So it's continued building downwards and upwards, which allows it to get enormous. Now, because the poles are on top of Antarctica and are now on top of, or on top of North America and Europe, Asia. Well, what this does is that the pressure of the ice itself pushes down on the land. That's one. But the other thing is that it can't go downward as much. Basically the ice just can only build to a certain extent. I mean, it can't build as big because it doesn't have the downward growth motion that it does when it's in the ocean. So you see right there, that's the giant north ice continent. I would call it an ice continent because that's basically what it is. And it just goes, it's right off of the large mountains of British Columbia right there. See, I don't know if you can recognize the continent right there. So what you also have as an effect is that these ice mountains in this ice continent is so enormous that it melts off of some of the edges, and you actually get giant freshwater rivers running right through, down into the mountains and right down into Canada and into the States and into Mexico. So you get that effect. You get these giant freshwater rivers going right through the continents. And on these ice continents, you can get rivers and you get lots of different things happening. And one of the things that happens, which is really interesting, is that when you have less water on the earth, well, one, you have more land. That's one. But two, you also have more pressure in one area. So what happens is that the ice is so heavy and pushes down onto the mantle at the bottom of the ocean. And literally the pressure ends up being all there. As of right now, the pressure is more spread out all over the earth. When the ice continents existed, the pressure was right down into the ocean. So you would have these gigantic, huge volcanoes, enormous volcanoes, spews of lavas, and it was all there. The largest volcanoes, the largest volcanic activity was right there on those ice continents, which actually creates a lot of heat, but also makes them a bit poisonous. Well, maybe not just a bit, very poisonous. And the creatures that lived on these ice continents would look alienesque and would look like they come from another time. But the reality is because they're exposed to so many toxins from these gigantic volcanoes that erupt through the ice and break through the ice. And also the other effect, which is really, really, really interesting, is that it becomes like a big chemical lab. You get these different chambers all over in the ice, and you get so many different effects of mixtures of different, chemicals and elements, and you just have these beautiful, beautiful rocks that you find there, and they just come off of the continent and into the ocean, and also down into the large ice water rivers coming from the ice continent down into the mountains. You get some really interesting types of rocks, and that's where you get the most precious of diamonds and everything. Everything that can be made is where you get the best. It's always there. So basically this is going on both. Right now I'm showing you the north one, which is supposed to be the other way around, right? So and the north one is the larger one, right there. And that's the effect for the volcanoes, but the effect on the earth is even more spectacular. By decreasing all this water on earth. I mean, this is so much water, it's not even funny. I mean, the sheer mass amount of ice that you get, I mean, it reduces so much water on earth that there's actually less water on earth than there is land. So now, all this pressure from the water that we have now, it's like pushing a zit, the pressure, when it's just at the poles, it pushes down, and so the pressure of the volcanoes pushes through the ice, right? And also pushes all around, a lot along the edges and in the mountains. So, I mean, that's one of the effects that I didn't mention, is that in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains, you get volcanic action because you've got this giant ice continent putting pressure down in that area, and especially in that area, more than anywhere else in the world. So, all the volcanic action tends to just happen there, and then there's less pressure all over the continents. So where there's less pressure, it's like, you know, if you put a lot of pressure on a zit, it'll pop, you know. It's the same principle with the volcano. So what happens is that all these volcanoes that we have now, we had none of these volcanoes when the poles were in the right position. When they were right, we didn't have those. In actuality, all these things, these volcanoes, they were actually just geysers. They were just geysers, and that's what happens. You end up having an entire area where there's little geysers everywhere, and you've got these outcrops of rocks growing out of water and land, and slowly and not violently. There is no violent volcano on Earth except near the poles, and sometimes in certain areas that are unique, but basically that's where it happens. So you get a calm Earth. You get a really calm Earth. You don't get a lot of volcanic action. You don't get a lot of earthquakes either, because actually the water has the same effect on the continents. And it's one of the reasons they say the continents seem to be moving faster. Well, it's because since the water rose so high, it's putting so much pressure on the land itself. It's literally changing it's the way it's being moved and the way it's placed. That's what's happening. So you get these giant poles, and that's where you get a lot of volcanic action. You get the earthquakes mostly there, but there's a lot of different effects that this Earth has. You know, having the poles all in one area like that. The temperatures of the Earth change. The way the Earth moves, it changes. The speed changes. A whole bunch of things change, right? So, I mean, you get different weather patterns and a lot calmer weather patterns. And what I designed is that mostly you did have actually larger land masses between Canada and Europe when the poles were in the right place. Because the ice came on top of that, it actually put a lot of pressure and actually pushed down lots of the land in actually a phenomenal speed. And I mean, this was connected, but mostly around the continents and around every single one of these continents, you have giant marshes, giant dinosaur marshes. I mean, we're reptiles, giant reptiles, because that's what dinosaurs basically are. They're giant reptiles. And their bones are porous because they live in water. They live close to water, they live close to seas, they live close to oceans. And it's actually the reason that when these poles melted, we lost dinosaurs the most. And it's not the only reason, because temperatures of the Earth became a lot colder. Because now, you see, the ice, it can't form in just one area. It had to spread out a little more. And then you get the speed of the Earth changing. So you get the effect that we had actually longer days when the poles were in the oceans. The other effect is that they also get a rounder Earth. I mean, having the poles in those positions. So basically, at one point I thought, well, maybe the poles change regularly. But the truth is that they never changed regularly. They were created, everything was created at the speed of light. It was stable, it was perfect, and we poisoned it. And when those poles melted, giant pieces of ice, scratched and scraped entire areas in the world. And these pieces of ice got stuck in places and left impressions. And you would find these strange creatures, and you would find these precious rocks and these different types of things that, you just wouldn't expect. But But that's what it was, is because when those melted, they just scraped over everything. That water, when it rose fast. It came like waves. It took the marshes first, and then it went into land, and it went all the way up into the mountains. The world is lucky it survived that change. It happened so quickly. So much of the earth changed at that moment that we're lucky we even still exist. But you see, these giant marshes, where you have the most giant one, is actually you get it off Antarctica, especially, but it also comes off of South America. You get this giant marsh right there. I don't know if I can show it there. That's fine. There you go, right there. See right there. There you go. That's the giant marsh. This is a giant marsh coming off of Antarctica and touching South America and a little bit of North America. And you had the largest, most exotic dinosaurs or giant reptiles living in those areas. And those areas had lots of little geysers everywhere. So you have all little geysers pushing up rocks, and you'd have these dinosaurs sitting on these rocks and hunting giant bugs and hunting each other. It must have been quite spectacular. When those waters rose, those marshes went first. So those dinosaurs, they got pushed far. And they got pushed into riverbeds, and they got pushed into a whole bunch of areas, you know. Basically drowning all these giant dinosaurs. So you would basically have had these giant reptiles, I mean, all around the continent. And the thing is that, sure, there's some areas where you get some ice marshes, some cold marshes, close to the poles. You get some of those. But for the most part, most marshes are actually quite warm. So you get the effect this world, you know, is very different. You can actually easily have all animals co-inhabit on this earth because there's so much space. And these giant marshes are the perfect space for these giant reptiles who are adapted to swimming in these giant marsh rivers. And, I mean, it was also very easy to travel in this world. You could use these giant marsh rivers. They're always calm. And, basically, I don't think you really have to worry about dinosaurs. Most of the time, dinosaurs are gentle giants. I mean, they're giant frogs and giant, turtles with unique abilities and unique, shapes and sizes and different defenses. And I mean, basically, that's what you get. From what I understand, I think they got dinosaurs very wrong in a lot of ways. I mean, sure, they had the porous bones, a bit like birds. Birds needed to fly. And, I mean, they needed it to float, because a lot of them, that's what they would do. They would swim on top of the water, you know. And, or some of them would, like the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which is quite an odd story, is actually a giant frog. I believe that its mouth is perfect for, like, snapping something up from underneath the water. It would swim down into the bottom, and it would stay there, and then when an animal would come along, it would eat it by jumping up and opening its mouth and eating it.